All right, we'll call to order the second Interim Joint Committee on Local Government with the first item on the agenda is our roll call.
Senator Alvarado, Senator Harper Angel, Senator McDaniel, Senator McGarvey, Senator Nemus, Senator Schroeder, here. Senator Southworth,
here.
Senator Storm, Senator Thayer,
here.
Senator Wheeler, Representative Bentley,
Here.
Representative Bray,
Here.
Representative Brown,
Here.
Representative Dixon,
Here.
Representative Donahue,
Yes, ma'am.
Representative Fleming,
Here.
Representative Frazier Gordon, Representative Herron, Representative Huff, Representative Imes,
Here.
Representative Johnson, Representative Koenig,
Here.
Representative Lockett,
Here.
Representative Marzian,
Here.
Representative Miller, Representative Reed,
Here.
Representative Roberts, Representative Thomas,
Here.
Representative Meredith,
Yes, ma'am.
Representative Mills.
I'm here. All righty. Second item on our agenda is the approval of our minutes from the June 21 meeting. Hopefully everybody's perused those. Is there a motion? I have a motion. Second? Is there a second? Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye. Aye. The minutes are approved. We have a array of guests here that many of us have seen before today to review and answer questions regarding the American Rescue Plan and how those funds that have made their way down to state government and local government and how they're being spent and used. And we're going to go in the order that our agenda lays out today. So the first person to come to the desk will be Mr. J.D. Cheney. J.D.'s hiding behind the post there. Welcome, Mr. Cheney. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be back in Frankfort and members of the committee. You know, if you remember last year, we had a big fancy PowerPoint and spent a lot of time with me talking about how these ARPA funds aren't a panacea for local governments. They're still not a panacea, but things got a whole lot less complicated between this time last year when we testified on a complicated proposed rule from Treasury about how to spend all of these funds in the adoption of the final rule, which went into effect in April from the Treasury, which made it a lot easier for local governments to be able to expend those funds. If you recall, last July, we had to fit our expenditures in certain categories and calculate revenue loss if we were going to spend it on forward-facing government services. Otherwise, it was infrastructure or expenditures to mitigate the impact of the COVID pandemic. That was difficult to slot and fit expenditure of the funds, especially considering how much local governments received. In April, the final rule went into effect from Treasury, and for most city governments in Kentucky, the first $10 million of what they received is able to be spent, assumed to be a revenue loss, and can be spent on any forward-facing governmental service. So besides a handful of cities, Lexington, Louisville, and I believe Covington, all of the city awards were under $10 million. So the complicated rules are out that we testified and spent so much time talking about last July. We're glad the Treasury listened to cities and counties across the whole nation about the difficulty in being able to slot them into, some of them, very specific and targeted policy-oriented objectives from Treasury. Just to summarize for you all so you know where the cities of Kentucky land, $931 million between the two distributions. $931 million went to 376 Kentucky cities. if you're doing the math, you're wondering what happened to the other 50 or so cities. We have 416 in Kentucky. Some of them, as you know, are defunct. Some of them, and we learned that they were defunct, some of them did not accept the funding at all, and that was redistributed to some of the non-entitlement communities. But the 376 cities that did respond and wanted the money, $931 million. There's a division among cities in the way that was calculated in Washington and the way that was distributed. Entitlement cities were able to split up a chunk of the city allocated money from Congress. Those were CDBG eligible communities. Kentucky had 9 of them, and that's Ashland, Bowling Green, Covington, Elizabethtown, Henderson, Hopkinsville, Lexington, Louisville, and Owensboro. Together, those 9 entitlement city governments got 607 of the $931 million. The rest of Kentucky cities shared in the remainder of it, the $324 million, and that is distributed, and that was sent through the Department for Local Government instead of directly from Treasury as a pass-through of what Congress allocated, and that was split based purely on the ratio of the population of the non-entitlement communities to other non-entitlement cities. A lot of cities have delayed allocating their funds. You got to keep in mind this is not a rush to spend. We have encouraged our cities, and like we told you last year, we encourage cities to hold back, really analyze how they're going to spend this money. They have until 2024, December 31st, 2024, to determine how they're going to spend the money. To obligate it, they have to spend it by the end of 2025. So there's not, kind of like we experienced with the CARES Act funding, a rush to spend it. So a lot of cities are being very deliberate in how they're going to do that. And so the final rule, as I said before, became effective April 1st. The reporting period went through March 31st. So we didn't even have reporting that reflected the final rule, honestly, at this juncture. So we don't have a great inventory. I am going to name some things that we know communities are doing, but we don't have a great inventory yet of what Kentucky cities are doing with the money. Our non-entitlement cities, all of them have reported appropriately to the Department of Treasury as required. Ashland, Bowling Green, Covington, Lexington, Louisville, and Owensboro have to report quarterly. Elizabethtown, Henderson, and Hopkinsville, along with all the other cities as entitlement communities, only have to do an annual report, and they did that for the end of April. As I said before, most cities hadn't reported how they're going to spend the funds because of that delayed final rule, and the first reporting period ran through March 31st with an effective date of April 1st of the final rule going into effect. And at that reporting period, cities only had half of their allocation at the time. Treasury has to publicize, so we're going to have a wealth of information nationally to be able to benchmark what Kentucky cities are doing again with other cities across the country. Treasury has to publicize that data submitted through that first project period. They have not done that yet. So on their entitlement cities, of the 4 cities that listed their uses on their January 2022 report, the most common use from entitlement cities was for public health, premium pay, which was authorized under that interim rule, response to negative impacts, and services to disproportionately impacted communities were the 4 top categories that they fit in under the old interim rule before the final rule became effective. Those 4 cities that had to do the annual report, the most common expenditures were response and vaccinations, premium pay, housing assistance, park and recreation improvements, drinking water investments, and provision of government services. Louisville budgeted $20 million for premium pay, Lexington $13 million, Covington $2.5 million for premium pay to go to eligible workers who perform or previously performed essential work during the pandemic as defined in the interim regulation. Bowling Green, another entitlement community, plans to use $16.5 million to establish a fiber optic cable to homes and businesses, an expansion of the Bowling Green municipal utilities efforts there. Lexington has budgeted $10 million for affordable housing programs. Those of you that represent Lexington and the Fayette County area know the issues related to that. Louisville set aside the same amount for their court eviction diversion program to help low-income residents retain housing. Covington set aside $3 million for various affordable housing programs to assess income-eligible households. Owensboro has promised to use $5 million of its total allocation to improve stormwater drainage systems, $2.5 million to replace aging water tower, $750,000 for public pool upgrades in a low-income area. Again, a lot of these expenditures are tracking the old interim final rule that were slotted in those categories. Lexington and Louisville have to publish. Unlike all the other cities, only Lexington and Louisville has to publish an annual recovery plan that outlines the proposed use of funds. They have to incorporate public engagement into that process to determine how to use the ARPA funds. They have to promote equitable outcomes, measure performance. Their process is much more complicated in Lexington and Louisville in terms of making those expenditures than the rest of Kentucky cities. Now, for the bulk of our cities across Kentucky, as we said before, Treasury still hasn't released those records, but based on our discussions and what we know that local officials are talking about in the smaller cities across Kentucky, the most common thing that's discussed, or most common question we're getting at the league, is how to do incentive pay or premium pay for essential work. There's a lot of discussion about using that premium pay, especially on public safety employees, in order to be able to retain them. A lot of them are doing that in terms of not a bonus. As you all know, under Section 3 of the Kentucky Constitution, we cannot give bonuses. So it has to be in consideration of work performed in the past or consideration of work performed in the future. Again, these could be, if they're permanently added to pay, create a structurally imbalanced budget going forward. So we're being very diligent in our cities are being diligent, and the league's being diligent in our counseling. I think the Department for Local Government the same, is to talk about the fact that this is one-time money. We're probably never in our lifetime see anything like this again. So building a budget and pay solely based on the receipt of these funds going forward, that they're going to have a continued revenue stream in order to be able to continue that. Just some other examples: police and fire equipment, vehicles, radios, one thing. Parks and recreation improvement seems to be a common expenditure. Eminence, Prestonsburg, Versailles, and Wurtland, I know I cover some of your all cities on the committee, are providing premium pay ranging from 70 cents up to $13 an hour on a go-forward basis. That's the cap on premium pay. Glasgow, Owingsville, Richmond, Williamsburg approved premium pay on a look-back basis. So they looked back over the pandemic to provide, not a bonus again, but retroactive premium pay for the services performed during the pandemic for their public safety officers. Those totals in Kentucky, at least, are not exceeding about $2,000 per employee, although the federal rule allows you to go up to $25,000 per employee. Kentucky, we're averaging out about $2,000 at this point on the premium pay. Central City, sewer line extensions, refurbishing water tanks. I know Executive Director Williams will probably testify on some of the partnerships with the state and what the General Assembly allocated. A lot of cities are leveraging their local ARPA money along with what the state and you all made available through the state budget program on water and sewer projects. Grayson, the city of Grayson's allocated $250,000 to become a gig city with ultra-fast fiber optic internet access. Paducah, $4 million for stormwater infrastructure projects. Back to Richmond again, Representative Fraser Gordon, providing funds for employees who tested positive or exposed to COVID to provide leave time when there's a positive test to be able to pay for the leave time instead of them using sick or accumulated sick or vacation time in order to do it. Winchester has provided premium pay of $329,000 for a COVID vaccine incentive program, $116,000 for COVID-related employee leave, kind of like Richmond. $1.1 million to assist nonprofits. You're going to see a lot of that assistance for nonprofits. A lot of city governments perform a lot of their public services by partnerships through nonprofit organizations, and some cities are talking pretty extensively about that. I will tell you as well, in addition to business and nonprofit aid for small businesses, a lot of communities are talking about investment, again, in the infrastructure, non-recurring cost. I think is really critical that our cities not structurally imbalance their budget with these one-time funds. And so they're looking at public space, public facility upgrades that have been delayed from an infrastructure perspective. Lots of discussions about sewer, water, and broadband and using those local funds. We have some economic development and workforce development programs that are being discussed to provide specific job training. Some communities are talking about skill-based training, matching, using the funding to do that. As we know, across the Commonwealth and in our communities, we have a tremendous workforce shortage. So a lot of cities are investing their monies in that. And then lastly, a major issue that we're probably going to be talking about over the next 3 or 4 years is cybersecurity. Our municipal and local government infrastructure overall is very vulnerable for cybersecurity attacks, and in fact, so vulnerable that the private insurance market is slowly backing away from even defining it as an insurable risk. And so being sure our city governments and our governments protect the information of their constituents, as well as their operational impacts from cybersecurity. So we see a lot of cities that are talking about upgrading their cybersecurity or their infrastructure, information technology infrastructure as well. I think Chairman Mills will end up with a lot more information after the Treasury publishes. And again, 2024 is end of 2024 is the obligation of these funds. The bulk of these have not been appropriated. Decisions have not been made about how to spend them. We have a lot of cities that, even though they don't have to, that are engaged in a public dialogue, that are getting public input on what they ought to do. And so there's not a rush to spend yet. That's it, Chairman Mills. I'll be happy to answer any questions from the city perspective, if you'd like.
Sure. Co-Chair Meredith has the first question.
Thank you, JD. Appreciate the presentation. And I had a member of the committee who's not here today who is watching, though, and asked a question. Can you explain the entitlement city issue a little better? I know that goes back to CDBG funding and all of that, but can you explain what qualifies an entitlement city?
So is this the ARPA original legislation weaved its way through Congress, which is it's hard, even though it's hard to imagine something being more complicated than a bill weaving its way through Frankfurt. In Washington, the process was an initial agreement between an initial agreement to provide local government funding. Then city and counties, our National League of Cities and the National Association of Counties agreed to split the local government portion equally between counties across the nation and cities across the nation. Cities, National League of Cities went further and said, well, on the city allocation, we need to ensure that the money goes to our larger cities, those with lower income populations. And so they did a split based on the CDBG funding formula. And that qualification has generally been, is it in a metropolitan area, one, and two, what is the socioeconomic standards of that community? And again, we have 9 in Kentucky. So their formula became part of that formula, and the 3/4 of it essentially went to the entitlement communities using something similar, Chairman Meredith, and the exact math we can get your member, something similar to the CDBG split on entitlement communities, and then the rest was done via population.
Is that a population thing that triggers that
There's
entitlement city?
There's population plus the socioeconomic conditions of the community, in it being in a metropolitan area, as defined by the census. But it did produce. I mean, a lot of Owensboro and Bowling Green, for example, called and said, "How in the world did Covington get more money than us? We're bigger than Covington," and those factors did play in when you look at how that came out.
JD, I have a question. There's a large amount of money flowing down to the cities from this ARPA funding, and was just curious. I know your answer may be that it's too early to tell, but I'm curious if this large amount of money coming into the cities is going to affect future revenue needs. Tax increases will it enable them to only take the compensating rate this year or next year versus the 4%? Has there been any talk amongst folks that you represent about that issue?
Chairman Mills, you hit on my worst fear. I'll say it again. This money ain't no panacea. It's temporary money, but it is our fear that we will have some legislative bodies perhaps make decisions that would result in a structurally imbalanced budget going forward. For example, if they permanently put in premium pay and use this money for premium pay to enhance salaries in a permanent way, when this money's spent, they're going to have to continue those increased wages through diverting other current resources or by looking at very limited resource options, as you all know, in terms of revenue, looking at that. But you do have a lot of communities, cities and counties both, that haven't taken the compensating tax rate at all. So some are delaying the impact of taking the compensating tax rate, not adjusting occupational taxes. It may have delayed some of those local choices related to revenue in most communities, probably, especially keeping up with the wage inflation in public safety and public works positions that we're all trying to chase. So hopefully, I'll say this, it's too early to tell. Hopefully, it doesn't have a major impact in decisions being made that create structural imbalances going forward after this money's gone, because it's going to be up to them, especially at the city government level, to figure out how to continue to pay those obligations if they make permanent obligations. I know there is a great intent, Chairman, from local leaders to invest this money in one-time infrastructure-type expenses for the most part, but we do have considerable discussion of premium pay because we do have such a crisis on recruitment and retention at the local level.
Can you just quickly touch on, I know we've talked about pay issues on teachers, police, fire. What is it doing to public works, the folks that are on the street, just real quickly in your cities? It's more and more difficult to get people willing to climb down in a ditch and repair a sewer line when you can go to Hobby Lobby or some of these other business, or sling lettuce on a taco at Taco Bell for the same wage rate. So even though we don't have a lot of attention on this yet, the public works area are generally very low paid positions, especially in our smaller cities. So the recruitment of workers that are willing to do that kind of labor, very labor intensive positions, is pretty intensive. And we've seen that with public safety. We've seen that with public safety too. Of course, all of our cities called when you all passed the state budget and said, well, the state gave 8%. Our city governments need to step up. We had a few cities that were able to keep pace with you all. Of course, we've reminded them that from a state government perspective,
while cities were given 2 and 3% cost of living adjustments, the state wasn't quite as aggressive as cities had been in the past couple of decades. But we're having difficulty keeping up with those wages, and that is why you're seeing, I think, a lot of cities migrate, or local governments migrate, to these retroactive premium pay or premium pay on a go forward basis up to 2024 to kind of Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid solution.
Okay. Leader Thayer has a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. JD, I'm going to follow up on Chairman Mills' line of questioning. You're not the only sector that's having workforce problems. Every sector is having workforce problems.
Absolutely.
We could have a committee meeting starting at 9 o'clock on Monday through 4 o'clock on Friday with every sector that's having problems getting people back to work. We see the numbers. There are plenty of jobs out there that a lot of able-bodied people apparently aren't willing to fill. And as we wrestle with this post-COVID, it's clearly one of the big negative effects that COVID is having on our society. What are you hearing from your cities as to the reasons why they're having trouble filling these jobs?
The wage rates are definitely common, and of course, Leader, I would not claim that we are unique in this. In fact, the difficulty in the private sector ends up impacting our local budgets through the receipt of occupational taxes as well. So we feel the private sector's pain. So we don't claim to be unique in that regard, but generally, it is the wage rate that we hear, and the affordability. The smaller the city, the less of a tax base you get. So take, for example, Hindman in Knott County. You have the mayor essentially who cannot afford under their budget to hire additional public works, who's out climbing in that ditch or repairing that because they don't have the adequate tax base in order to hire them, and they don't have the funds. But then you go to a city like Florence or Bowling Green, which has some natural growth in their economy. They're better positioned and better able to be able to keep track with the wage rate. So you don't have other attractive positions, but we do have, like you said, just difficulty in the type of the job. The difficulty in the type of the job, the labor-intensive nature of public works, or in the police sector, people just not interested in doing that where they have other alternatives.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the same vein, JD, are we seeing, as it relates to the occupational tax, all these work-at-home matters? Have they hurt cities, small, medium, and large, with people working from home, and a lot of them not paying the occupational tax because they're not going back to the office? And what are the trends in local government as it relates to work at home? I know in state government, the Beshear administration is still allowing people to work at home, and I get constituent complaints about it all the time because state government, which already had a pretty slow response rate, is slower than ever. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that in the local government sector.
In terms of local government employees, I'm happy to say that the bulk of our city employees are back on the job in order to provide those public services that you think typically provided by cities. That does not permit a remote work in most cases. So on that issue, you'll find in most our city halls opening, our people out making the repairs, our police officers who never went home, our firefighters who never did remote work, continuing to do that. So local government as an employer is not seeing a lot of remote work. However, it has not played out yet, at least in the data, that the work from home in the private sector with regard to the occupational tax does impact. You all are very familiar as members of this committee with the way our local tax system works, that it is a privilege tax for working, our occupational tax, whether it's payroll or net profits or gross receipts. It's on the business. If it's on the business, it's for the privilege of operating the business within the certain jurisdiction. Then when you come to employees, it's for privilege of working within the jurisdiction. If the work is performed outside of the jurisdiction levying the tax, then they cannot collect. They can collect. The employer, under our statutes, under state statute, collects, but the employee is entitled to a refund for work performed outside of the jurisdictions. And we did see, with state government in particular, when state employees went home, the personnel cabinet, I believe, switched their employer withholding process and had employees say, well, I'm working from home in Richmond. I'm working from home in Georgetown. Where the city of Frankfort would have collected that tax to start with, the personnel cabinet started withholding and remitting to the jurisdiction of the home work location of the individual. Frankfort was very much impacted. We had a few other employers who did that. Covington's another example of that, with a large employer up there where they switched that. We have not seen the deluge of refund requests that at least to this perspective or to this point that we anticipated. But you were right, Leader Thayer, that if that continues, it shifts the whole notion of the way occupational taxes are collected, not where the physical location of the business is on payroll, but where the employee is performing the work. It could have a tremendous impact where you have the infrastructure of the business located in downtown, and then you end up having the employee working elsewhere.
One more follow-up. Leader Thayer.
Excellent answers to my questions. Thank you. Of course, I'm old-fashioned. I think people need to get back to work, but I might be too old-fashioned, and I think we're going to have to watch and see if this becomes a permanent trend. I hope it doesn't, but sometimes trends become a permanent part of society, and that's going to be an issue for local governments to wrestle with.
Yes, sir, Leader.
Co-Chair Meredith.
Mr. Leader, I'd just like to say that I have a fantastic bill that will modernize that taxing structure for you to consider next session.
Thank you, Chairman.
All righty. With that, we will end our questions for Mr. Cheney at this point, and we'll bring up Ms. Sandy Williams, the Executive Director of the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority. And Ms. Williams, in your opening comments, if you could remind us how KIA actually works with DLG and that relationship, just as a review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I'm Sandy Williams, Executive Director with the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority. Thank you for having me here today. I am prepared to speak briefly on the status of the ARPA funds that were, appropriated to the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority for water and sewer projects. I'm sure as the committee remembers, in the Senate Bill 36 from the 2021 session, there was $250 million appropriated for water and sewer projects. We're calling that round one of the ARPA funding. That the round one funding was split $150 million, which was allocated based on a county's population, $50 million, which was allocated for consent decree projects and unserved water, drinking water projects, and $49.9 million to be used to supplement a project grant where the cost was greater than the county's allocation. We're happy to report on the round one funding. The first $150 million has all been approved. The $50 million for consent decree and for unserved drinking water projects has all been committed. $20 million was committed for consent decree projects, and I will remind the members that that was for Lexington, Louisville, Northern Kentucky Sanitation District Number 1, and Winchester. And $30 million was set for unserved drinking water projects. Again, 100% committed. And the final $49.9 million to supplement a project grant, we will be using that to supplement projects. I'm sure you have all heard construction costs are increasing, and we will be using the final $49.9 million as the project bids come in. We will use up to 10% of the grant amount to help any project that needs supplemental funding. The round 2 funding from the 22 session, House Bill 1, again, $250 million for water and sewer projects. There were no breakouts for use, so all $250 million is available based on county population. We are asking that all of the water and sewer providers within each county get together, come up with a local consensus on how they choose at the local level for those funds to be used. We're suggesting that any round 2 funding be first used to make up any funding gaps in round 1 projects. So if a round 1 project was not fully funded by a grant and it's sitting there waiting on additional funds, we're asking that the round 2 funds at least be considered to be used for that project. We will use the same process. We'll use our project profile in our water resource information system as the application, and the button is live, so if a utility chooses to apply, they can coordinate with their area development district water coordinator and select 22 HB001 Cleaner Water Program fiscal year 2023 as their funding source for their project, and go ahead and start applying. The formal call for projects will be happening later this month. We're coordinating with the area development districts just to remind them that their utilities will be coming to them to apply for this funding. And those are my prepared remarks.
Very good. Any questions real quick as we start? Representative Donahue has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you repeat that form again, the 22 for applying for the funding?
Yes, sir. 22 HB as in boy 001 Cleaner Water Program fiscal year 2023.
Thank you. Thank
Yes,
you,
sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, you hit on something that I've asked a couple of questions about over the last few months. We all know projects are escalating, but sometimes when we know that, it seems like all the projects automatically start escalating. So when you start getting requests into your office for supplemental to make up that difference, are we requiring that those projects have multiple bids? Are we allowing a single bid project to just state, hey, my costs are going up, I need more money? How is that dealt with in your office?
That is a very good question. We are requiring that all the projects follow KRS 45A.
Okay.
So
And that requires
multiple bids, yes,
okay,
sir.
Yes. All right. Any other questions for Ms. Williams? Well, these funds, I know folks all over the state are talking about these funds and making plans, and there's definitely a need out there that hopefully we will see the fruition over the next couple years with better water systems and sewer and things of that nature. So if there are not any other questions, we'll ask for you to kind of stay around. Maybe we might have another few questions pop up here at the end, but Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Next is Mr. Jim Henderson with the Kentucky Association of Counties. Mr. Henderson's a regular in our committee as well. So welcome, Jim. Floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Mills. It's always good to follow JD because some of what he says I can just say ditto. A lot of those generalizations would apply to the county situation as well. I did put a very short slide, which I think is maybe 4 slides, 2 of them's an intro and a close. So basically 2 slides of substance in there for you to look at if you want to reference any of that, just with the timeline. But thanks for including me in the conversation today. I might explain just briefly how counties were treated a little bit differently. As JD talked about the city allocations out of ARPA, in the American Rescue Plan Act, $65.1 billion. JD referenced the split on the local government allocation federally. $65.1 billion nationally was given in direct, flexible aid to every county in America. There are 3,069 counties across the United States, and so every county got a direct allocation. That wasn't true in the CARES Act, the precursor legislation, and that really kind of drove NACO, our National Association's focus on really lobbying in this legislation to be a direct allocation to counties. We were fortunate in Kentucky. Both JD and I and our respective organizations formally asked of the governor when all that was first allocated in the CARES Act and was early days of the pandemic. We asked for a direct allocation in Kentucky of that large amount, and we were fortunate as a state to get a significant portion of that. The intent by many federal legislators was for a significant portion of that to go directly to local governments. And in many states, it just didn't work out that way. So again, we were fortunate. But from the national discussion, it was really important in this legislation, at least for our association nationally, to lobby for direct aid directly to counties, again, because so many did not get that. You all also know, some of you know, that we couldn't have had a better representative at the national level on behalf of counties during all this time. Boone County Judge Executive Gary Moore was actually president of NACO during the time this legislation was passed, and so he was very instrumental in seeing that direct allocations to counties occurred in that bill. And I often like to reference, and as JD said when we testified last year, I think we said this, Judge Moore's role and many of us in county government's role was not necessarily to argue the merits of whether or not there should have been a $2 trillion bill, but if there was going to be, and there was going to be, then it was important to see as much of that money into the hands of local governments as possible. And so that was Judge Moore's focus when he lobbied to get that allocation. So in the slide, it talks about a little bit of an overview, one of those slides, about the amount that came into Kentucky. So I think we got $867 million or so of direct allocation to counties in Kentucky. And some of that blurs with Jefferson and Fayette. They got a city allocation as well as a county allocation. But all 120 counties also got an allocation in addition to the cities inside those counties, as JD mentioned earlier. The first rounds of money were released for counties, and again, a little bit different with the counties. They had, in May of last year, counties had to apply directly to U.S. Treasury. A lot of counties had never dealt directly with the federal government with funding, had been accustomed to working through some state agencies. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, honestly. To have gotten the direct allocation, it was fantastic. It kind of took a layer of bureaucracy out in terms of all of that. But there were a lot of counties that just had never dealt directly. And so they relied pretty heavily on us as an association to at least give guidance, to give some answers to questions. And we did that, have done that over the past 16 months, briefings, in-person training, guidance. But again, last May, a year ago, just a few months after the bill passed in March, counties could apply directly to the U.S. Treasury and draw down the first 50% of their allocation. And they could not get their second 50% any sooner than a year later. And so really last May into June into July, and even I think a few counties were as late as August still making that first draw. And at that point, again, as JD mentioned about the rules, there wasn't a lot of clarity about what you could use some of these funds for. And I dare say out loud this, which is usually an internal signal to not say it, right? But, I think there were counties struggling at that time whether or not they thought they could put this square peg in a round hole. I mean, whether or not they would have expenses or things that fit the federal guidelines that they could actually spend that much money, which sounds like a good problem to have, right? But even in those early interim rule areas that you could spend money for, things like public health, like reimbursement for COVID-related expenses, a lot of those have been covered in the CARES Act. A lot of counties have been able to qualify some of those things in that first round here in Kentucky. Negative economic impact was another one. It's hard to quantify some of those things. We hadn't really seen it fast enough to say this is what it was. The premium pay was authorized then, and broadband and water and sewer were one of the earliest eligible expenses. Again, you would think, well, that certainly most counties could use it for that, and many could. Surprisingly, there are a lot of counties, and there may be counties you don't expect, that have pretty good broadband coverage. Some of our eastern Kentucky counties, where they have rural phone co-ops, actually have fiber optic to every house. So some of those county officials were struggling. If I've got to spend this on broadband, we've already got broadband. And so again, putting these things, square pegs in round holes, was a concern. From the very beginning and even now, some things that it could not be used for, that many counties would have liked to have used it for, it cannot be used for pre-existing debt. Some counties, carry debt, some more than others, and would have been a nice way to get that off, but that was not eligible. And as you all remember, these funds could not be used for pension liabilities. So again, in the early days, there was some question about what they would be able to use these funds on under those very limited rules. Again, as JD mentioned earlier, had to be obligated by December of 2024, not spent till December of 2026. So KCO, like KLC advised, a lot of our counties just take it easy. Don't be in a big hurry. Think this through. Let's make sure that we know and try to make really sound investments with one-time money. Again, much like I know you all have had to struggle or figure out to do with some of the state one-time money that has come. But January 22 really was when the light bulb went off, or the manna fell from heaven, or whatever the term is that you use, that the U.S. Treasury said that they were going to create this presumption of lost revenue for any county that had less than a $10 million allocation. Went into effect in April, but in January they gave that guidance that was going to happen. That was a game changer for a lot of our counties. All but 18 counties in Kentucky got less than $10 million. So really, that was the lion's share of our members who had this freedom, really, to qualify the money under that one stipulation. And then, my staff tells me not to tell these little anecdotal stories and jokes, but I relate to those things. Then it became kind of like the gambler putting money in the plate at church. I remember a pastor back home who used to struggle about whether or not they would take proceeds from winnings from gambling. But once it goes in the church and it's prayed over, it's clean, right? And so kind of the same analogy with this. Once the money was qualified as lost revenue, then it was clean. It could really then be used for about anything, because that was the qualifier. And so again, all but 18 counties were able to use that if they wanted as the federal qualifications. And again, I've said, as JD said many times here today, but he's covered a lot of this, April was the first reporting for the quarter, and most of those counties other than the 18 will only have to report annually. So there is no reporting mechanism at the state level. And there's certainly no obligation for them to report anything to us. We've certainly learned about what counties are doing or planning to do with the money. But other than that relationship that we have with our members, there's not a reporting mechanism that we see other than what goes to Treasury. And I actually did look at it last night until my eyes got kind of glazed over. And as nobody would be surprised, there's nothing very simple about looking at a federal website and trying to find user-friendly information. It's Excel spreadsheets buried deep in tabs, deep inside other tabs that you have to know the questions to ask to know where to look. And finally, I did find, and it's pages and pages and pages and pages of an Excel spreadsheet that was just put out in the last week or so. So we will try to look at some of that. It does show some of those quarterly reportings for April. But again, just quickly perusing, almost every county's qualification for the federal funds that they used is the lost revenue. So again, it's opened it up quite a bit. The second round of funding, which is just now becoming available, is trickling in now. So again, counties all got their first half a year ago or so, and now they're able to pull down the second tranche, another word that I don't use normally that I had never heard before, ARPA, but that's the federal description, the second tranche of money coming through. And so still, there are a lot of counties debating or deliberating, I should say, about what to use the money for. They really are trying to figure out what the best use is. And, in all fairness, there are a lot of political pressures on county officials, just like there was on the legislature, I know, during the session, on what to do with that money. There are a lot of different ideas that have come in. And Chairman Mills, as you asked earlier of JD about the kind of the unintended consequences that might happen for local governments. I've heard county judges and county officials talk about that it's really hard to talk about some of your pressing, ongoing operational needs, and those things are not going to be fixed by these funds, and yet the citizens see that you're getting $2 or $3 million, or in some counties, much more than that, and they don't really see those as different. And so it's somewhat challenging to have had this opportunity for some of our counties to figure out, because it is one-time money. It's much like the cities and the state counties looking at how to best use these one-time dollars. I will talk a little bit about a few of those that some of you all know, and I really hope, and I think this is true, that best, better than I do, even probably what some of your county officials are doing or talking about doing with these funds. I hope this is something that's being talked about in your community, that you have a relationship with your county judge or fiscal court, and that you've been in conversations with them about this. And I hope they have been with you. And so I'm not sure I can tell you things about your specific counties that you might not already know. But a lot of the counties are investing in broadband. It's a huge issue. Obviously, if there is broadband and high-speed internet in a community, it's more likely in the more concentrated areas, more likely in the cities. But this issue is really challenging out in the counties, out in the rural areas across the state. I know, Chairman Mills, you know this very well. Your judges over there have been working for a while on a regional approach. And while a lot of counties have invested in the broadband or made a commitment to invest in the broadband, there's also been some reluctance on the part of county officials to go ahead and commit these dollars to broadband, because there's so much other potential broadband money out there. And so any reasonable county official who knows he's got 2 or 3 pots of money will be thinking about, how do I best leverage all this? And I think Scott County is a great example, Leader Thayer, where they've been working on a broadband project, maybe early on thought ARPA might be the way to do that, maybe finding some other ways, freeing up some of the ARPA money for other investments in the community. So again, a lot of counties are focused on broadband. Warren, as you know, Chairman Meredith, Judge Buchanan, right out of the gate, it's been a big issue for Warren County, committed about $10 million of their allocation. I think their allocation was 27 million. Christian County committed, I think, $13 million to a countywide fiber optic project. Davis County, I think they committed another $10 million. And a lot of this we've just gotten from even their local press, the things we've learned through press coverage. Oldham County, I think, put about $8.5 million into broadband. But of course, Boone, Kenton and Campbell worked together. Boone leveraged an incredible relationship with Cincinnati Bell up there, and will be putting broadband into every house into Boone County, one of the faster growing counties in the state. So you've seen those examples of investment in broadband. Barron County, great collaboration project, worked with their water, of course, is another easy one for people to say if we don't know for sure what to do to put it in water. Barron County worked with the Glasgow Water Company to put $1 million towards water improvements there. I've got a little list here of a few counties. I need to look at that. I know that my home county, Simpson County, I was proud to see our city and county work together to take both of their allocations and invest in a public safety communications upgrade, something that, quite frankly, in my time as judge, we talked about. It's hard to think about spending that kind of money on radios for our law enforcement. We knew we needed it, but it was a big ticket item. Our city of Franklin and Simpson County have allocated roughly $1 million apiece towards a major improvement in their public safety. Hancock County, I think, is also investing in a big public safety communications project. Webster County had kind of a unique project. The county had never had a county park. Early on, that was one of the eligible uses, even before it loosened up, is if you could tie back in some kind of physical activity, and it's a long way around to do it, but there's a way to connect all that was eligible under the federal guidelines, and they're working on a major park improvement. I think Judge Henry and the court may have allocated all of their ARPA funds towards that project, something that they would have otherwise not been able to do. A lot of counties have actually spent some of their money to purchase some one-time equipment that's really expensive in public safety, like an ambulance. Ambulances are extremely expensive. Representative Fleming knows this issue very well from our EMS discussion over the last year, and one of the big challenges in these rural counties is EMS. Being able to purchase a $250,000, $300,000 ambulance with this money for some of these counties has been very, very helpful. Premium pay, as JD mentioned, is also something that has been talked about among counties. I will say, early on, we cautioned counties about that, and our role is not to tell a county what to do. We work for the counties, but to be very careful about creating this expectation on wages that might not be able to be sustained after this money runs out. A lot of counties did more of a one-time rather than a wage change, more of just a lump sum. Again, there are some tricky ways to call it something other than a bonus. I shouldn't use the word tricky either. I'm not very politically correct. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. But there are qualified ways to give one-time monies to public safety, frontline workers, others who were deemed to be essential workers that wouldn't constitute a bonus from the perspective of what the auditors might call that. But again, a lot of this is yet to be in some place that you can look at collectively and put together something. We'll be working on that. It's important for us to know. It's important to have that reference point. A lot of counties are still waiting, and you might be surprised, I hope you're not, that we know this, it's an election year. And you might be surprised that some county officials who are not going to be seeking re-election, or who know there's going to be a significant change on their fiscal court or the decision makers, may very well wait to let the next administration have input on that. I personally, as a former county official, appreciate that perspective at the county level, because obviously, this money is going to way outserve any one term. Again, our role has been advisory, assistance, answer mostly questions. But again, ultimately, these dollars went straight to the county because the belief was that county officials would know best how to spend these funds. I think I've covered as much as I intended to. I may have skipped over a few things that I earlier thought was important, but if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer those. And I've got some of my staff here that can also answer technical questions if needed.
Senator Southworth has a question.
Thank you. I recall hearing that we definitely could not use ARPA funds for roads, but this new rule that you said kind of just presumes the revenue loss. Does that mean that this essentially goes to the general funds and that those things could be money laundered or whatever you want to call it, some legal way to cover road
I talked
funding?
about cleansing it. I don't know that I use those terms. The short answer is probably yes. That there are many uses that a county could deem that these funds would be spent for once they qualified as lost revenue. But the funds do have to be kept in a separate fund. There will certainly be most of the counties, I think all but a handful, are going to get enough that it's going to trigger a single audit, a federal funds audit. And so I think counties will be very careful about making any of those leaps. Most of the counties that we've talked with are very focused, again, on making investments, but certainly I think an argument can be made that a road or a bridge would be a critical investment in infrastructure, but most of the counties aren't doing that, at least the ones that we've talked to. Most of them are focused a little bit more on those other areas. So,
Thank you.
Any other questions? Tim, thank you so much
thank you.
for your input, and all of the folks that came today to give information. Is very, very well timed information. There's just so many dollars floating around out there, and it's good for us to all be prepared to answer questions from our constituents when they ask those out on the street. So if there are not any other questions, our next meeting will be August the 25th at the State Fair, and you'll get plenty of information where our meetings will be and how to park and how to get in and out of the center. So thank you so much for being here today, committee members. And if there are not any other questions, we stand adjourned.